Tonight, everybody, welcome. We're going to unpack the political disruption which is being caused by community independence and really try to understand what its causes are and what the options might be for the future. And what inspired tonight's conversation really was watching the ABC program Total Control and seeing there that grassroots community-based political project, which was based on values and a candidate offering a choice. But we also got a depiction of Australian politics with a widespread sense in that community of the impact of poor decisions, failure of service, and real disillusionment with government. So with that sort of background, making the ABC TV on a Sunday night, what we wanted to talk about tonight is how is it that community independence, the movement that we're part of, became the backdrop to this, political thriller on primetime TV. So to help us with that backdrop, we've got two famous Australians, and no big introduction, but Simon Holmes at Court and Walkley Award winner, Kerry O'Brien. And not only am I going to be asking questions, but I'm hoping they're going to be talking to each other through the night, the conversation will go for about an hour. We want to be finished at 8, and then we're going to wrap up with just some final comments from Jill and Alana Johnson, who's part of the CIP team. But let's begin with you, Simon. Can you share with us how you first discovered community politics and became so deeply involved?
Thanks, Cathy, and I'm embarrassed to have in your introduction billing before Kerry, but I assume that's just because of the order of the run sheet. Thank you. Community politics. I actually see this more as community organising rather than community politics. That so much. When I talk to people in the movement, this is not about this is not about partisan or ship or playing for a team. This is the people who are fighting or working hardest on this, who are giving most of their time, are organising. They're the community organisers, the people who organise all the community events in their communities. But I first, I guess, got into community organising with the Hepburn Wind Project about 15 years ago. Some of your attendees tonight will know we built 2 turbines on Leonards Hill, just 10 kilometres south of Daylesford. Those 2 turbines put as much power to the grid as the houses in Daylesford take out, and it's a cooperative. It's owned by 2,000, just over 2,000 members, majority of whom are local, and was the first community wind farm in the country. Took an immense amount of community organising, starting from someone who had the crazy idea and was told it could never happen, and it just built. And as it built more and more, we attracted more and more confidence from and more skills from people who are in all sorts of skills and activities within the community, and I got to interact with lots of other communities, and it's the same kind of people that are involved in community independence movement as we're in the community energy movement. Past that, I got involved in the Kids Off Nauru project back in 2018, I believe it was, and I put up a cheeky fundraiser on Chuffed, and in 3 days, I put up a fundraiser saying if we can put, and it was just at the time where Alan Jones had twisted the arm of Louise Heron at the Opera House and got Gladys Berejiklian, bullied her to get a horse race projected onto the Sydney Opera House. And I was outraged by that, and I was outraged by the kids who were stuck on Nauru. And I just put out a cheeky tweet. It went viral. About, why don't we project pictures of kids incarcerated on the Sydney Opera House sails? I put out a fundraiser for it on Chuffed, and it got $117,000 in 3 days from about 2,000 people. It was an amazing experience, and then I had to go and follow through. But I learnt there that there is just such a community online who are connected, who are passionate about seeing a different Australia. Through that, I got to meet Karen Phelps. She was working very hard on the Kids Off Nauru project, and I saw how this community-supported independent was able to get a bill into the lower house, and I believe it was the first loss of a government against a bill against its own bill, I believe, in 90 years. So I saw firsthand how an independent can have immense power and change the narrative, and that's how we got the Medivac bill. And I helped. I supported through a fundraiser Margot Kingston's No Fibs campaign, and I got to see how communities were putting up independence, and that inspired me to start Climate 200, the initiative that I'm currently. That was one of the big inspirations. We supported a number of candidates through the election, but what I learned from that is it's not enough to be a good bloke or a good candidate. We can't compete against the major parties on money. We need the communities behind, so without a strong community behind a candidate, it's just really ambition, and that's not enough to carry it through. So I'd say your book, Cathy, really inspired me. These community candidates are just an amazing. The vetting that happens by a community means you don't get duds rising to the top. I got to meet people, some friends, new friends in Mosman behind Zali, and saw how they did it. And then lastly, your Getting Elected event in February, when I saw about 300 people from 70-something electorates all turn up with such enthusiasm. And it's just been clear to me that there is the groundswell of support, and we're seeing it Climate 200. That's enough for me for now.
Yeah, well, that's a great story of a journey. So I'll come back to pick up that theme a little bit later. But over to you, Kerry. Welcome. And can you just tell us a little bit about where your interest lies? Is it community? Is it disruption? Or, what do you think is the background to this?
Look, my interest, Cathy, really stems from the stage of life I'm at, 50 years of journalism. And the future I'm looking to is more the future for my children and my grandchildren than my own. And over the 50 years, there have been some high points in our democracy and there have been some low points. But what has worried me to the point now where I think it's close to alarm is that there has been this really significant gradual drift in the quality of our representation, in the public's capacity for trust. I think we're at a point now where there's a collapse of trust in public institutions, but particularly in politicians and the political process, in the institution of Parliament. I think that's accompanied by a disturbing rise in the power and influence of vested interests in the halls of government, with further worrying signs of public corruption that is becoming institutionalised as well. I'm worried by government's increasingly opaque and secretive manner of operating. I worry about the media's capacity to resist government attacks on the public's right to know. I think this is an environment where we've got a weakened, struggling media in an age of digital disruption, under attack from unscrupulous forces that want to disarm its effectiveness by flooding the internet with false and manufactured stories. I worry that we have a seriously unhealthy level of media ownership by one proprietor in this country, dominating the commercial media, and with the public broadcaster at a time when its presence is so important, so increasingly important, that's under constant government attack and whose budgets are being deliberately, I believe, constantly eroded. I worry particularly about the era of highly orchestrated fake news. That infamous quote of Steve Bannon's, who for a significant time was Donald Trump's right-hand man in the White House, his comment in 2018 in an interview where he said, "Don't worry about the Democrats, we'll just flood the zone with shit," which represented to me a fundamental assault on liberal democracy. You create the lie, you flood the internet, you overwhelm the mainstream media's capacity to properly call it out and reveal the lie. You feed the public's mistrust and you fan the flames of fear, of prejudice and hatred. And you are attacking and undermining the very foundations of democracy. I also worry about where we're headed in the age of what's called surveillance capitalism, where our privacy has been effectively looted for profit by a small handful of giant global internet operators who appear to be able to operate outside the capacity for individual governments to properly regulate, which you would expect in a civil society in countries that are supposed to have sovereignty. I worry about the polarisation of our society, and this is a deep concern, I think, and it should be a deep concern for all of us. A polarisation of society in a way that I have never seen before, never witnessed in a half century of journalism to this degree. Not just polarisation around a single inflammatory issue like the Vietnam War back in the 60s and 70s, but the increasing polarisation across the face of our political landscape, our media, polarisation in our media, rippling right through our society. I worry that we're losing the capacity to talk to each other across across the differences that we humans have always had and always will have. The thing that has saved us as humanity has been our capacity to talk to each other and find resolution. I think we're forgetting what it means to live in and protect a civil society.
Oh, thank you. So we're going to unpick a bit of that, or unpack a bit more of that as we move along. But I'm really interested from both of you. What is it? I'm interested in the history of how we got here, because you're both great observers of the Australian psyche. But I'm also interested in what is it about now that has brought this to a head? So Simon, I'll just give you a chance, the history and the now. What do you think is going on in the country that's actually created the space, I suppose, or the time? Look, for example, I watched the video tonight of Zoe Daniels, who's announced herself as a candidate for Goldstein. And she basically said, well, if not me, who? And if not now, when? What is it about the time? And I'd be interested in both of your reflections on that. Simon, you're on mute. Yeah, you got it.
I'll start. Thank you. So there's a deep frustration with our Parliament's inability to deal with some big issues. Going back now almost 2 decades on our cruel refugee policy. So many people I know still feel sick to their core when they think about what is being done in our name, and they see the literally billions of dollars that are being spent each year. And that, although so many Australians are really deeply uneasy about this, we've seen no progress on that. And then we moved to the issue of corruption. Going into the last election, there was the Watergate scandal and the Grassgate, and then we heard it later on about the sports rorts, car park rorts, and the Leppington Triangle, and Porter's Blind Trust. And when my local member, Josh Frydenberg, was asked about the Blind Trust, he responded, that it's within the rules. And it just, we all know that it's totally unacceptable, but the major parties are happy to leave the systems in place that allow this to continue. And lastly, the biggest issue for me, and I know for so many Australians, is climate. Climate action, Australia's been playing a wrecking role since at least 1997 at the Kyoto conference. And especially in the last 8 years, we've dismantled so much of the infrastructure that would have put Australia in a position to not only fulfil our responsibility, but to grab the opportunities. So for the last 8 years, we've done so little. Morrison drew a line in the sand before Glasgow, saying essentially that he intends to do basically nothing over the next 8 years. So there's that helplessness, which a frustration, and knowing that feeling for so many people for so long that there's been nothing they can do about it. Now, a couple of things have happened. There have been some very strong independents going back a long way. People got a taste of independence with Oakeshott and Windsor's, got people to sit up and listen and notice that politicians were able to put the needs of the country ahead of their political futures. Very risky for those two, and they ultimately paid a price at the ballot box. And then Cathy, your time in Parliament showed set such an example to the country of how an independent could bring their community into Parliament, and the strong integrity message carried on by Helen, whose bill was it yesterday or this morning? It was this morning. Sorry, yeah. It's funny, on Twitter, life goes fast. It was this morning that that Helen brought her integrity bill before Parliament, and one brave Liberal crossed the floor.
So could I say it's like a few lines have been crossed for you, and you see the opportunity there now?
Yes, one of our members for Climate 200 said it beautifully recently. They said that this movement of community independence and this groundswell of community support and the funding and the media narrative, it gives them great hope, and they see that these initiatives, these community initiatives, and Climate 200 provide active hope. So we can sit at home and complain about the Murdoch media, or we can sit at home and complain about Liberal Party or Labor Party or Nationals, whatever. But this movement, we can get out there and we can actually make a change. And it's not a huge change. We don't have to reinvent create a new party and grind away for decades. We are so close, just 2 or 3 more strong community independents in Parliament. And as I often say, we wake up on the morning after election to a very different country.
Great, well, thanks. So what I'm really interested in, Kerry. I've read your memoirs and thoroughly enjoyed, your observations that you make about how the world. What do you see in the history, and what do you think? Why is it now that this disruption is having, and it's got such momentum?
I think it's been a long time coming, Cathy. I think people fundamentally feel disenfranchised, and that's not just those millions who've lost their jobs with the digital disruption and the not just the digitization, but the automation in traditional many millions of traditional jobs, not just around Australia but around the world. A sense of uncertainty about the future, and looking to leadership to demonstrate a capacity to engage us in debate and help us help them find a way through the process, through the anxiety, through the challenges. This is an era of momentous change. And it has been, the whole post-war period has been a period of enormous change, but particularly with digitisation. And that change is only coming at us faster and faster. And so with that disenfranchisement, coupled with that disenfranchisement and with that change, has been, I think, this degeneration of our major political parties in their capacity to respond. A classic manifestation, quite a dramatic one really, has been the process of changing prime ministers as you would change socks, where we went from Rudd to Gillard to Rudd to Abbott to Turnbull to Morrison in the space of 6 to 8 years. And you need to look at what those failures are in the parties. And I think that the Liberal Party, if you think of it as the party of Menzies, who was its founder, it was a party that could claim some middle ground. It was a party that could claim that it wasn't driven by an extreme on either end. And most particularly, it wasn't driven by the extreme right. That's the party of Menzies. In the case of Labor, I think that they went from a system in the Whitlam years where factionalism often got in the way of good government. Through Hawke and Keating, they came to see the sense of having functional factions, and those factions did seem to serve them well as a way of having organised political debate, often tricky and tough political debate through all the changes that they introduced, but nonetheless, it provided an order, and it also folded in the promotion of people through the system. But it just became too ingrained, too entrenched, and too rigid. And I think what's happened now is that the factional process seems to serve not just primarily, but almost totally the ambitions of its individuals, while at the same time, when young parliamentarians come in, moulds them in its image. And I think that's also happened with both parties. I think that the age where people came into politics as a vocation, they now treat it as like any other career. And like any other career, it's about your own development, your own advancement, looking after yourself first, and then perhaps looking after the others around you. And at the same time, let me say that there is still a great deal of good intent on both sides of politics, but the system is now against that. I think that the system is too rigid. I think genuine, spontaneous debate is discouraged. Politicians sound like automatons when they face the media because they're trying to stick to their party lines, and the public sees through that. All those interviews that I did over so many years, where the frustration of the audience with the failure of politicians to answer the tough questions, to answer the questions that might have been difficult for them or might have even been potentially a bit embarrassing for them, that the frustration of the public with that was palpable. Yeah. Now, these things have to find an outlet. And there have been times in history when that outlet has been violence. And I think one of the, just very quickly, I think one of the manifestations of that frustration now is this movement of independence. It's striking a chord. And Cathy, I should say this just to be clear. The difference between me being here and Simon being here, Simon is an activist and good on him. I'm here not as an activist. I'm certainly not here to promote any individual or endorse any individual or tell the public how to vote. I want the public seriously to contemplate how they make their vote count. I've had so many people over the years come to me and say, I'm frustrated or I'm angry about this particular issue. What do I do about it? And there are two things you can do. You can go to the media or you can go to your local politician's office and complain. And we all know that 95% of the time, when you go to your local politician's office to complain about the failure of his or her government, it's just not going to go very far. And so I welcome this debate that you and others are espousing around the country to challenge people to think about how they individually can help to get us out of the situation we find ourselves in.
That's fantastic, because I really want to talk about that debate and the journey that we're on as a nation. And I just wanted to put in a little bit of, like you mentioned, Menzies. So one of my really favourite stories that I discovered when I was an independent in Parliament was in 1941, when Menzies was Prime Minister. In that 1 year, we had 3 Prime Ministers. So we had Menzies, and then with the help of 2 Conservative Victorian independents who changed their support, Menzies retired, and Artie McFadden, who was the National Party, the Deputy Prime Minister, but a country party person, he became Prime Minister. So you've got to watch your Deputy Prime Ministers. He was Prime Minister for 6 weeks, didn't work out. And then John Curtin came in as the Prime Minister just in that 1 year. And it was the two conservative independents who switched allegiance, if you want. John Curtin became Prime Minister. And then he became Prime Minister in that period, I think for about 18 months until 1943, when they had an election. And then he was overwhelmingly endorsed by the nation. So, and I just keep thinking about that because it was another period of enormous disruption in Australia during that Second World War. The troops were overseas, they had to be brought home. We were being, defending Australia from the attack from Japan. And the times gave rise to the leadership that we needed. So to me, there's something in our history about independence, about national crisis, and about the community being able to do what it needs to do. But before I move off the history, there's just 2 things I really want to talk about, or I want to ask you about. First off, and Simon, just to give you a minute to think about it, I know you've paid attention to the power of money and lobbyists to do things, and that impact. And Simon and Kerry, for you, I know that you've got just a great interest in the media and the opportunity of the media and particularly the public broadcaster. So I just want to give you a couple of minutes to talk about that before I move into the next part of the conversation of, well, where do we go with this disruption and what are the opportunities? But Simon, I'll just pass it to you to talk a little bit about, your insight about the power of money and what it can buy you. You're on, yeah.
Thanks, Cathy. So we saw at the last election, Clive Palmer invested nearly $90 million in the last election. Didn't win a single seat, but he shifted preferences so that the coalition held on to some seats, or maybe even won some seats that were unexpected. So his $90 million wasn't enough to win a seat, but it had a significant effect, and some might say a decisive effect on the election. That seems like a lot of money to pay, but it set up the conditions for favourable conditions for Palmer's coal mine next to Adani, a $6.4 billion mine. So when you think about it, it's actually a really, really good return on investment. And that was only a small part of the money. The last federal election, about $360 million went in from the parties, and that's all the disclosed money. There's likely significantly more dark money that we don't see. So we're unfortunately at the moment in Australia, as well as the general election, there's a money election, and it seems a bit ironic me pointing this out when I'm heading up this organisation that's trying to get money in to change politics. I'm very much inspired by Lawrence Lessig, a law professor from Stanford University, who's done a lot of advocacy for fixing America's democracy. And he makes the case that we have to put money into politics to get money out of politics. We need to get the right people into Parliament in order for them to pass the kinds of reform packages that are going to end this money election to the greatest extent possible. So I'm really pleased that a number of campaigns that we are supporting of strong community independence see this problem, that money is corrupting our democracy, that it influences who has access to members of Parliament. You know, people sit next to pay $10,000 or $20,000 to sit next to the Prime Minister for lunch. That gives them access, that helps them set the narrative, that ensures that their staff ultimately find their way into the Prime Minister's office, and people from politics go back into industry. So that revolving door between lobbyists and parliamentarians. So to get those reforms, I believe can only come from the crossbench. The federal ICAC in New South Wales came in at the urging of crossbenchers. The fixed term limits in Victoria came in at the urging, the Bracks government had to negotiate with crossbenchers to form government, and they did so on the condition of having fixed 4-year terms, which I think is a major integrity move. So I believe we've got to put money into politics in order to get money out of politics.
Great, thanks. And I know many of us have seen The Big Deal and that documentary that explains it. And to you, Kerry, I know the public broadcaster is it underpins for you the important democracy and how it works. Would you like just to talk to us a little bit more about how your thinking is around that?
Well, there are so many things you can say here, Cathy, but the fundamental I start with is that a democracy is never going to be any stronger than the strength of its media, of its free media, as in unfettered media. Having said earlier that we're at an age where mainstream media is absolutely struggling to respond to the challenge of the digital age and digital disruption. And the things that I have witnessed in the last, say, 10, 15 years as manifestations of how that struggle is progressing, and I would say not well. One of them is the way in which newsrooms are now younger than they were. I'm guessing here, but it's an educated guess, that if you were able to do a proper survey comparing newsrooms around Australia, not just the ABC, but generally with newsrooms of 10 and 15 years ago, I suspect you'd find that the average age of journalists now is at least 10 years younger than it would have been 15 years ago. And that is because, as part of the disruption, there have been many redundancies. Staff numbers have dropped dramatically in many mainstream traditional media areas. And in the shedding of those staff, many of the staff that have been shed, because they're the ones who are paid the most and therefore the most expensive, have been the most experienced. Those with the age, the experience, the scars, the memories to know how the game is played in politics and amongst the other institutions that make up our society. I grew up and for many years always had a mentor. I looked for them. I looked for the people who were going to help me grow and become a better journalist. Now, so many of those young journalists operating to now, as bright as they clearly are, do not have the mentors. Mm. Then you've got the increased commercial pressures on proprietors. So in newsrooms today, there are many journalists who don't have the time anymore to go out and cover stories in person. There are times when they don't even have time to lift the phone to properly pursue stories down the thing. There are times when press releases, whether it's press releases from politicians or press releases from a big corporation or any other institution or organisation that has an impact on public life and public lives, where those press statements are virtually reported unfettered and unvetted. The processes of quality subbing in newsrooms has deteriorated significantly, and you can see the evidence of that in so much of the online reporting. So and then you've got, as I say, one proprietor in this country with somewhere close to 70% of all print output in the country, which has a substantial influence on the rest of the paths that the rest of the media pursue, the stories they pursue and respond to, the 24-hour news cycle, which also stresses the time of individual journalists. And the end result is you see this diminished news coverage. And even though you can see evidence of good investigative journalism with organisations like Fairfax and the ABC, and at times Murdoch, where I believe there has been a suffering across the board is a lot of the areas where journalists have traditionally covered what you might call the ordinary news of a day. Ordinary but important, ordinary but fundamental to our lives. And it's at all levels, whether you're talking about courts, whether you're talking about local government, whether you're talking about state government, whether you're talking about a whole raft of areas that make up community life. So what I'm coming to is that in this great media struggle, you've got the ABC, which remains the most trusted institution in this country in an age of gross mistrust. Somehow, despite all of the attacks that have been directed at the ABC, at its independence, that have been directed at its trustworthiness, at its credibility, at its integrity, all these questions and all these attacks that have taken place on the ABC, it still stands like a beacon on the media landscape as the most trusted institution in the country. And yet, here we are under attack. Now, you know, it's amazing to me that the ABC has actually achieved record audiences in the recent past, the largest news audiences in its history. It leads the country in its online news coverage. And yet I know that inside that place, dedicated people who have been used to a culture that says, shoot for the stars, go for the best quality you can produce in the time you have available, and where you need that time and where we can, we will give you that extra time because we are encouraging the pursuit of excellence. And I know those program makers, those journalists are struggling because their resources are increasingly limited as they try to meet the expectations of the public. And you know what? Day by day, sitting out there looking in on the ABC's coverage, whether it's radio or television or online, and they're not noticing the corners that are being cut of necessity, of the ways in which journalists are trying and struggling to still provide the best coverage they can with increasingly limited resources and time and so on. But it happens incrementally over time. And then suddenly you realise that something precious has been lost. That is my concern. And I'll say again, there has not been a point in my lifetime where the ABC has been more important. And I really, 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 I want it. I want people who say they love the ABC or who say they rely on the ABC, I want them to stand up and be counted. Now, how they do that is their own business. I want them to think about it. I want them to do it in a very clear-eyed way because it is vital to the future of this country, along with a number of other things that we've talked about.